And we're recording. Hi, this is Catherine Morgan. I am a career transition expert, small business consultant, and the founder of Point A to Point B Transitions, Inc., as well as the depression discussions. And I wanted to start the depression discussions with someone who's actually qualified to talk on the topic, because while I often play therapist with my clients and with myself, I am not a therapist, and I am ill-equipped to talk about it from a therapeutic point of view. So I wanted to welcome my friend Rich Gallagher to be the inaugural interview for the depression discussion, and he actually is qualified. He's a licensed marriage and family therapist, and he'll share the rest of his qualifications.
Well, thank you, Catherine. I'm delighted to be here. And I'm so glad that you're having these conversations because I think they're so important. In terms of my background, my biggest qualification is that I've been a friend and colleague of yours for many, many years. And so I'm really delighted to be here. I am a licensed psychotherapist and was in private practice for close to a decade. As you know, I wrote a book on treating anxiety disorders, which is my clinical specialty. And I'm also an expert in communication skills. And that, I think, ties in also with depression. So there are really 2 points I want to make about depression, particularly when it comes to people like entrepreneurs and job seekers. The first point is depression is a treatable issue that varies a great deal from person to person. And so it's not always just a matter of life circumstances. Some people, I'm going to throw out a couple big words here. Some people have what I call endogenous depression, which is their brain is wired in such a way that, the way they process serotonin, they're not normally as happy as other people, and some things maybe are more difficult. And then there's what we call situational depression, where you're struggling with your business, or you've just had a big life change or a big job change, and you're struggling with that. And the point I want to make is that both of them, through the eyes of a clinical expert, are treatable problems, and they both can be worked with, and almost everybody can feel better with the right strategies. Which brings me to my second point, which is the way you treat depression, including the kind of lifestyle depression that people in your audience faces, is with structured procedures that work and aren't human nature. The one thing that just drives me batty as a therapist is all the lifestyle articles about happiness and depression. So when you're dealing with somebody who has a clinical depression or a big life change, and they read an article that says, take a walk or eat more chocolate chip cookies. I mean, first of all, people should know that golden stuffed Oreos are much more clinically effective than chocolate chip cookies. But seriously, but we therapists have structured processes. They're not human nature. If more people knew about them, they could use them and practice them as well. And I want to walk through sort of the big four that we use backstage when we're behind closed doors with people who are depressed. I'll start with the big one, which is what I call developing agency. I wrote an article on LinkedIn about this recently called A Simple Hack for Being Much Happier. And the way I'd lay it out is as follows. When something happens in your life, good or bad, you put yourself on a spectrum silently between helplessness and agency. And the difference is when one person says, my business is struggling and the world is terrible and I don't know what to do, that's helplessness. When somebody says, my business is struggling and I'm hurting very badly right now, and I have these lousy choices, but here are my choices and here's what I'm going to do, that's choosing agency. The difference clinically in the way people feel when they choose agency instead of helplessness is huge. And one of the things that we do in therapy is always help move people up that spectrum from helplessness to agency. Suffering is inevitable sometimes, but helplessness is always a choice. And this is particularly important for entrepreneurs because taking action is the single biggest thing that your business as well as your mood lives or dies on. And so the first thing that I want people to do is take out a sheet of paper, put down what your lousy choices are, and choose what you're going to do.
I love that you only give them lousy choices. They're not like so-so choices or awesome choices. We got the lousy choices.
Awesome choices are great when they happen, but I really want people to get out of the mindset that you have to have great choices before you can take action. To give you a very personal example, when my father was dying of cancer many years ago, we all felt horrible about it. But I got him involved in a clinical trial. And what it did for both of us to actually try to do something about it made a big difference in the way he felt and the way I felt. Unfortunately, he wasn't one of the lucky ones. But the fact that we did something, that made a big difference in how we felt in that moment. And so that's what's so important about agency. The other thing I want to say about agency is when your choices seem lousy, this is the single biggest roadblock that people have to taking agency. And so, sort of a sub point I want to make here is that we think we know what's better for us, but we don't. I'll give you a personal example on that too. So when I was a therapist in private practice, I was really busy. I saw like 20 clients a week plus consulting, as a writer and public speaker. And so I'm always really busy. And every year I would close down my practice for 2 weeks at Christmas. And I would say to myself, this is going to be great. I'm so busy. I can't wait to have all this free time.
Did you get all twitchy?
Yeah, at 3 days into it, I'd be logy and depressed and feel stuck in the house. And in that moment, it would seem like the last thing that I wanted to do was go back to work. But sure enough, when I go back to work on January 3rd, my mood was always shoot back up again. But to turn this around again from a clinical standpoint, when we work with people who are depressed, we prescribe activity to people. And the activity sometimes feels lame to people, but the act of doing those activities and then seeing how you feel afterwards is critically very important. And we have some really cheesy tools that we use, like David Burns's pleasure predicting sheet that we use to get people to prescribe action every week and take action. So that's my first thing, is developing agency and taking action for what's going on in your life. The second one sounds disgustingly like lifestyle advice, but it's what I'm going to call changing your thoughts. We have a clinical term for it called cognitive restructuring. I hate it when I read an article that says, oh, change your attitude. I don't know anyone, including me, who's ever been able to change their attitude. However, you can, with some very structured techniques, change the things you tell yourself about a situation.
Right.
And there's some good science behind that. And it's one of the more clinically effective tools that you can use to change your mood. If you've ever read the book Feeling Good by Dr. David Burns, which is the best-selling self-help book in history, I licensed Dr. Burns's materials for my therapy practice, for example. And his worksheets for taking what's bothering you, freezing it on paper, looking at what we call cognitive distortions or errors in thinking, and then rewriting those statements so that they're realistic and less scary and actionable is what changes your mood. Burns' second chapter in that book, I believe, is called How to Break Out of a Bad Mood. And that's the strategy you use to do that. So here's another example of that. So many people, I live in a college town, Ithaca, New York, home of Cornell University. So there's a lot of successful people here. And it's not unusual people would come into my office and say, Rich, I'm a failure.
And they have a PhD and they've had
correct, and they do have a PhD.
Career.
Exactly correct. So if I were to say to them that, look, Steve, you're not a failure. Look at you, you're a tenured professor, and that's not going to make them feel better. What does make them feel better is when we go through some structured exercises where they get to the point where they say, I'm pretty good at A, B, and C, and I believe that. I'm horrible at X, Y, and Z, and I'm never going to be better at that. So I'm going to accept that. And I could change D, E, and F, so here's what I'm going to choose. So again, this circles back to using language to create options for yourself and open space for yourself. Know carefully, we're not prescribing positive thinking. There's a part of your brain called the amygdala. It's a little almond-shaped gland that decides whether you should worry about something or feel bad about something. And it smells blood when it hears positive thinking. So when I say, okay, Steve, you're going to be fine, the amygdala is going to just jump right into action and say, no, Steve, you need to worry about this stuff. But if Steve instead comes up with language saying, here's what I should really be worrying about, and here's what I should care about, and here's what is a problem for me, and here's what hurts, and here are my options, and here are my choices. And here are the things I'm actually really good at, and here are the things that are normal for me. Take entrepreneurs. They feel so alone when they reach a first business setback.
Terrible.
But they do,
and they're the only ones who's ever failed. There's so much drama around it.
You are right in my wheelhouse, Catherine, because if they realize that this is a predictable part of every path of every entrepreneur, and this is a phase that everybody goes through, then you can work with that. I mean, just a quick story. When I first started consulting back in the 1990s, I've been self-employed for the majority of my life at this point. I'm very proud of doing very well at it. But in 1996, all of my second year out, all my contracts ground to a halt at once. And my wheezy old car had over 100,000 miles on it. So I go to my dealer and think about trading to maybe a used car that won't be as unreliable. So what the dealer does is he wheels out the most beautiful new car I've ever seen with every option imaginable and says, you know, Rich, you could lease this for $300 a month. You're only on the hook for 2 years. If you've got the assets, you can always turn it back. And I did the numbers and it worked. I'll never forget the feeling of having had no work in 3 months, having no idea when I ever work again, driving off the lot in the most beautiful car I've ever owned. But the way I felt when I got behind the wheel of that car, you know, it's like taking a fresh shower and having a nice suit on. Yep. That was a big factor in my success. I kept that car for 7 years, paid it off early. It was a very good clinical intervention that I did.
Yeah, I can see that that would make a giant difference in your whole attitude and how you went back and approached your business.
Exactly correct. So as that's a good example of what we do clinically with cognitive restructuring. So the third thing I want to get to is mindful awareness. Now, some people, when I mention the word mindfulness, they'll say, oh, do you mean meditation or yoga? And the answer, oh, no, I've tried that. That doesn't help. The answer is no. Mindful awareness is a very specific clinical meaning. It means observing rather than emotionally reacting to what happens in your life. It sounds really lame, but when people practice, the effects are extremely powerful. There's a great article I'm going to recommend to people because I've been trying for years to make mindfulness sound less lame, especially to young people. There's an article that was written in 2015 by Eric Barker in Time magazine. It's called How to Stop Worrying. And it lays out beautifully the whole process of how to use mindful awareness. He later wrote a book called Barking Up the Wrong Tree that includes that. That's now a New York Times bestseller, and I saw that coming first.
Okay, I'm all about the mindful awareness, though. I have to tell you, I describe it to people as, you know, on the radio stations, they have that button you can hit it in case somebody accidentally curses.
Yes.
That's how I think of the benefits of mindfulness.
Nicely put.
Just enough distance that you don't get sucked in or react.
And you've worded that beautifully, Catherine, the idea that you've created some distance between you and what's happening emotionally in your life. You know, before I came up with Barker's article, I had what I call, and I still use what I call the mindfulness trifecta, which is 3 things that you do to create a state of mindful awareness. The first thing is imagine your thoughts up on a movie screen, and you're sitting in a comfortable chair watching these thoughts. Very often you're going to see a very familiar script to this movie. And I want you to compassionately look at those thoughts up in the movie screen and say, hey, that's me. You know, there's that my business is failing script again. There's that I'm not worthy enough script again. And so just observe those thoughts. Say, oh, yeah, there they are. Those are just thoughts. The next thing I want people to do in the second step of this mindfulness trifecta is to ground yourself in your physical reality. The classic strategy in therapy and in mindful awareness is to be aware of your in-breath and out-breath. Some people find that very healing. I personally, being very type A, feel that's like watching broccoli grow. So if you're not into that, the next thing I recommend is like people watching, for example, or being aware of the sights and sounds and smells. I actually use an exercise that Captain Tom Dunn, who runs fearoflying.com, has, and he has a video on this online that you can Google. It's called the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 exercise, which has you count 5 things that you see in your vision, 5 things that you hear, 5 things that you feel physically, and then 4 of them, 3 of them, and 2 of them. By the time you take 3 boring minutes out of your life and done that, you've pulled yourself out of your thoughts and into your senses. Again, clinically very important, even though it sounds lame to the untrained ear. Then the third part is what I call making a wise decision. And a wise decision isn't always the brave decision or even the right decision, but it's a choice. Now, clinically, what's going on here is that we have this very tight linkage in a triangle between thoughts, feelings, and actions. And you're trying to break that linkage. Normally, something bothers us when we go right down the rabbit hole of depression. And so by observing the thoughts, pulling yourself into your physical world and grounding yourself, and then choosing what you're going to do next, you're breaking that linkage. Here's a sort of a clinical example for when I treat people's fears and phobias. Let's say somebody has, you know, contamination fears, and they see a red spot in their shoe and say, oh my God, that's blood, it might be AIDS, I might die.
Right.
That the wise decision might be, I'm going to try to sit with this for an hour and see how I feel an hour from now. Or a wise decision might be to say, if I don't take care of this, I'm going to be obsessing about it all night, and I've got a prelim tomorrow, or I've got a presentation tomorrow, and I'm not going to be able to. So I'm going to let the fear win tonight. I'm going to change my shoes. Either of those are choices. Either of those are wise decisions. Either of them are your decision. But I want you to choose your behavior, not just have it be pulled down the rabbit hole by whatever you were feeling in the moment.
I'd love to tie that to job search right
Yeah,
now.
absolutely.
That just jumped right out to me, that somebody is in a death spiral of obsessing about never working again, and oh my God, I'm unemployable, and they're just, spinning. Well, you pull out a little bit and say, well, actually, I have been employed for the last 20 years. There's a good chance that I might be employable. People jump into my career transition practice thinking that, they roll out of some company and they had 200 people reporting to them and now they feel unemployable. I'm like, well, 2 weeks ago, someone was paying you $150,000, $200,000 to manage this whole thing. Now you're unemployable. What happened here?
Oh, I love what you're saying. And I wanted to circle this around to your process, because you said at the beginning of this discussion that you're not a therapist. I'm going to differ just a bit, because you're not a licensed therapist yet. But the thing is that I'm very familiar with your work, and you have a structured process for when people are unemployed. I mean, your white paper, your process, when people work with you, they feel like they're going somewhere because you have actions and activities that you put them through. So so you're straight down Broadway, with a very clinical approach to the unemployed.
Yeah, very much. And you talked about the benefit of taking small steps and how that can keep you out of the depths of despair. I call it the black pit of despair, and people laugh a little bit, but we've all been there. Like I've camped out there for a while. So if you can do little things that build, progress and skills and some self-confidence, again, you can get out of the black pit of despair.
Absolutely. So, I mean, in the interest of full disclosure, I don't tend to suffer from clinical depression. If you cracked open my head, you'd find a pretty happy guy inside most of the time. But, I, like anybody, we're all vulnerable to situational depression. One of the toughest periods of my life was when I basically left corporate life for the last time, knew at my age I wasn't coming back, and really wondered where the heck my life was going. And I used to joke to people during those dark days for me that the most powerful antidepressant that I could take would be a book contract. And I was correct on that. I landed a contract with a publisher, wrote one of my first customer service books. The rest was history. And what that did for my mood to say, I'm working on my next book. That was a ticket for me, for example.
Fantastic.
So that leads me to the last thing I want to talk about, which is part of the reason you and I are talking, which is connecting with people is so critically important when you're suffering from a depression. So first of all, your fellowship with other people does a lot of those clinical steps, like normalizing what's happening in your life, comparing notes with other people and seeing that you're not alone, getting support for each other as you go along. There's a lot of really good science behind the idea that when you're connected with other people, you feel better. And when you do things to engineer those connections into your life, that's one of the other things that clinically we often try to do is, let's say somebody suffers from social anxiety. It's really hard to interact with people. I'll prescribe small steps like say hi to the checkout clerk at the grocery store tonight, or find some social event that you could easily escape from, dip your toe in it and see how it feels, or reach out to those people that you really like and connect with, or take some small steps to build those connections. And so engineering more contact in your life is very important. And I want to circle us around to something very serious and very important that you said at the beginning of this interview, which is too often we have these discussions when we lose somebody. And before I became a therapist, I was a counselor on a suicide prevention hotline. And
I forgot about that. Right.
It was a great experience. All my life, I never knew what to say to somebody who was at risk of suicide. Now I do. But there's some good evidence base behind the desire to end it all. And far and away, people who want to end it all are disconnected, and they feel no hope of having connections with people. So this may not work for everybody, but the single biggest evidence-based intervention for suicide that we see in the literature is to connect with other people, is to not be alone. When somebody comes into our office and is suicidal, the first thing we do is create a safety plan that always involves who they're going to be with or who they're going to talk to. Calling crisis lines is a very powerful evidence-based intervention. People who call crisis lines tend not to kill themselves. And so building that connection is important for the most critical of problems and even the everyday problems that we all deal with.
Not to compare thoughts of suicide with a Black Day in job search,
Sure.
but that also is something that I highly recommend to people who are just having a really terrible day. They just got, they thought they'd landed this job. They'd had 5 interviews. It was all sunshine, roses, and puppy dogs. And then, there's a hiring freeze. They get aced out by an internal candidate, and they're losing their minds.
Of course.
If they're having a really terrible day, I say, just call it quits go play with some dogs, play with some kids, volunteer somewhere.
That's wonderful.
Like if you're in a really, really bad headspace, the best thing you can do is go help someone else. Because as bad as your life is, generally, if you get into somebody else's life, you're like, you know what, my problems are all good. I'll keep mine.
Absolutely. And I want to build on that just a little bit. I think it's really important to reach out to friends. I think it's really important to reach out to family. I also want to say that from my experience, sometimes they're actually the worst people to help you or advise you when things are going wrong. So consider the possibility of bringing a paid professional into the mix who knows what they're doing and knows what they're talking about. So consult with Catherine if your career is the issue. Consult with a good therapist, and be sure to interview therapists and make sure you click with them, because the personal connection you feel with them is really important. There's the old joke. What do they call the person who graduated last in medical school? Doctor.
Nice.
So,
what? It's funny, Rich. I don't know if we've ever talked about this, but I have worked with some clients who do have diagnosed clinical depression.
Sure.
And they've filled out the requisite forms. And I have spoken with their therapists, and we've coordinated and tag teamed the person to support them and kick their butt to get them into motion when they were very much at risk. He had, a parent who had dementia. He had, a job loss, and then he had a divorce going on after 20 years. Like his world imploded. So sometimes, you can get your professionals to work together and support you. It's happened a couple times with my clients.
I love what you're saying, because what you're saying is you have to treat the whole person. And, we all have things going on in our lives that we have to consider as part of who we are. And, we're not just job search professionals. We're not even just psychotherapists. So this team approach of, using professionals as you need them, where they're consultants and you're still the boss, I think that's a good strategy to have as part of your toolkit.
Absolutely. Well, Rich, thank you so much for sharing so much wisdom and for being my inaugural interview for the Depression Discussions. You gave us
such a pleasure talking to you, Catherine.
So much to work with.
And
thank you.
Best of luck with this series. Take care.
Bye.